I saw him before he saw me, standing there at the airport in that same proud stance he always had, hands in pockets, chin slightly raised, like the world still revolved around him. Years had passed since the divorce, but time hadn't taught him humility. He looked right at me, the smirk spreading across his face like he was still the man who once held my future in his hands. "So you file paperwork for the army now?" he said, loud enough for the people beside him to hear. I didn't answer. I just smiled, small and calm, the kind of smile that hides 100 untold stories. He laughed, turned away, and I could almost hear the old echoes of his arrogance follow him down the terminal. I stood still, not angry, not embarrassed, just quietly amused. He thought I was still the woman he walked away from. He didn't know that the same silence he mocked had turned into steel. He didn't know that the woman he once called weak now had wings strong enough to shake the sky. Thank you for watching, my dear ones. I'd love to know where you're watching from, so please tell me down in the comments. It always warms my heart to see the places this little voice of mine can reach. My name is Edna, and I live in a quiet town in Mexico, not far from the hills where the sunsets look like gold spilling into the sea. Life here is slower, gentler, and that's how I like it now, but it wasn't always this peaceful. I came here after everything fell apart, after the noise, the arguments, the papers signed and sealed, the words that could never be taken back. You see, when you spend years beside someone who looks at you like you're ordinary, you start to believe it. My husband, or I suppose I should say my ex-husband, made sure of that. He liked to tell people I was just good with forms and files, that I handled the boring side of things, while real soldiers did the real work. Paperwork for the army, that's what he'd call it, as if my hands never touched anything more meaningful than a pen. And for a while, I let him say it. I let everyone believe it, because arguing felt like shouting at the wind. After the divorce, I tried to rebuild my life quietly. I rented a small house near the airfield, where the sound of engines reminded me that movement still existed, even when life tried to stand still. I'd sit outside in the evenings with a cup of tea, watching the planes rise into the clouds, and something deep inside me would ache. Not with regret, but with recognition. That used to be my world, before love turned into limitation, before I gave up my wings to play the role of someone's shadow. I remember the early days after he left. The silence in the house was unbearable. Every drawer I opened still smelled like him. Every room whispered what I had lost. And yet, inside that emptiness, something stubborn began to breathe again. I think the most dangerous lie a woman can believe is that her story ends when someone walks out. Mine didn't. It simply paused, waiting for me to pick up the pen. I began working odd jobs to stay afloat, teaching English to local kids, helping at the small airstrip when they needed an extra hand. Nobody there knew my past, and that was fine with me. It felt good to be anonymous, to rebuild without pity or praise. Some nights I'd hear pilots talk about missions, weather, routes, and the language of it all felt like home. That's when I knew I wasn't done with the sky. Not yet. The truth is, my ex thought he'd left me behind in a pile of papers and memories, but what he really did was free me from the cage he built. I stopped dressing to please, stopped apologizing for dreaming, and started living like the world didn't need to understand me. When people would ask, "What do you do, Edna?" I'd smile and say, "A little bit of everything," and that was enough. I didn't owe anyone explanations anymore. Looking back now, I can almost thank him for that smirk at the airport. It reminded me that some people only see what they want to see. And others, well, they see what they've lost. He saw a woman standing alone with a suitcase, not realizing that inside that suitcase was everything I needed to start again. My peace, my strength, and the quiet fire he could never put out. There's something strange about starting over when the world thinks you're finished. It almost feels like cheating time, like stealing a second chance right out from under life's nose. In the beginning, I didn't know where to start. I just knew I couldn't stay the same. I'd spent years living in someone else's shadow, waiting for permission to shine. And when that shadow finally walked away, I was forced to learn how to stand in my own light again. The first step was the hardest. I remember walking into the small recruitment office in town, my heart racing like I was a young woman again, and when I told the officer I wanted to serve, He looked at me like I had told him I wanted to walk on the moon. You? At your age? He asked. His brows raised so high I thought they'd fly off his face. I smiled, calm but firm, and said, "Yes, me." He laughed softly, not cruelly, just disbelieving. That disbelief never stopped me before. The training was brutal. Early mornings, cold wind biting through my bones, hands blistered from the controls, muscles screaming for rest. The younger recruits didn't know what to make of me. Some respected me. Others just ignored me, thinking I'd quit within a week. But what they didn't understand was that pain didn't scare me anymore. I'd already lived through a kind of ache they couldn't imagine. I wasn't there to prove anything to them. I was there to remember who I was before life got quiet. Every day I pushed a little harder, ran a little faster, and learned to fly again, not just planes, but myself. There were nights when I'd sit alone in the barracks, my body aching, my mind whispering that maybe he was right, maybe I wasn't cut out for this anymore. But then I'd think about the way he smirked at me, the way he told people I was just a paper pusher, and that thought would light something deep inside me. I refused to let his version of me become my truth. So I kept going. I studied harder than anyone, stayed late after every drill, and when the instructors noticed, they started treating me differently. One of them, a woman named Captain Harris, once said to me, "You've got more grit than half the men here." I didn't say anything then, but inside I smiled. It had been a long time since anyone saw my strength without trying to take it away. The first time I took the controls in training, I swear my hands trembled, not from fear but from memory. The vibration of the engine, the sound of the wind pressing against the fuselage, it all came back like an old song I'd forgotten the words to. I could feel the power beneath me, the freedom waiting just a few feet off the ground. And when the wheels finally lifted, I felt tears slide down my cheeks. It wasn't just flying again, it was reclaiming everything I'd lost. Up there, no one could interrupt me, no one could tell me who I was supposed to be. I belonged to the sky again, and that feeling, that quiet power, was something no one could ever take away. Sometimes, when I look back on those early days, I realize that the hardest part wasn't the training or the exhaustion. It was believing that I still had something left to give. But once I did, everything changed. The woman who once sat in silence while her husband laughed had become the woman people turned to for courage. I didn't shout my success from rooftops, I didn't post it for the world to see, I simply lived it. And somehow, that was enough. I still remember the day they handed me my wings, the metal cool in my palm, the light catching it just right, and for a moment I forgot to breathe. It wasn't just a badge, it was everything I had fought for. Every tear, every bruise, every long night when I wanted to give up, but didn't. When they called my name, I walked up slowly, steady. Not because I wasn't proud, but because I wanted to feel every step of that moment. I could almost hear my ex-husband's voice in the back of my mind, mocking, dismissive, saying I'd never do anything that mattered, and for once I didn't feel anger. I felt peace, because I knew I had proven him wrong without ever needing to say a word. My first few missions were nothing extraordinary, at least not to the outside world, but to me, they were everything. Each one reminded me of what it meant to be trusted again, to hold responsibility and purpose in my hands. I worked with rescue units, flew into storms most pilots avoided, and spent nights in the cockpit with nothing but static and silence as company. Every time I landed, there was a quiet satisfaction, not in being seen, but in knowing I had made it out again. I had come back stronger than when I left. The others began to notice too. I could feel their eyes change, the way they looked at me no longer filled with doubt or amusement, but something closer to respect. That meant more than any medal ever could. There was one mission, though, that changed everything. We were caught in a sudden electrical storm during a medical evacuation. The clouds were so thick it felt like flying through smoke. Lightning flashed so close it turned the inside of the cockpit white, and I could barely hear the radio over the wind. My co-pilot panicked, shouting coordinates, but the instruments were failing one after another. I remember gripping the controls, steadying my breathing, and thinking, this is it. This is where I find out what I'm really made of. I don't know how long it lasted, maybe minutes, maybe hours. But when we broke through that wall of darkness and saw the open sky again, it felt like being born a second time. We made the drop, delivered every person safely, and landed battered but alive. When we stepped out of the aircraft, the others were waiting, faces pale and wide-eyed, and someone said, "You're like iron, ma'am, you don't break." A few weeks later, the nickname spread through the base. Iron Widow, they called me. At first, I laughed it off, but deep down it stuck. It wasn't about loss, not for me. It was about resilience, about surviving what others thought would destroy me. Every time I heard it, it reminded me that strength can be quiet, that sometimes the fiercest warriors are the ones who never brag about the battles they've already won. After that, things changed. I was no longer the woman they overlooked in briefings or passed by in the cafeteria. I became the one they called when they needed calm in chaos. I didn't need to raise my voice or prove myself anymore. The work spoke for me. And in that silence, I found something I hadn't felt in years. Respect, earned the right way, not demanded. That was the moment I knew I had become someone different, not just stronger, but freer. I had built a new life on the ashes of the old one, and even though the world still saw me as quiet, I knew the truth. The quiet ones aren't weak. They're just busy listening, waiting, and when the time comes, they fly. After that mission, life began to move differently. Slower in some ways, heavier in others. I had proven myself to everyone around me, but deep down I still had moments where I'd sit alone in my quarters, staring at the same pair of gloves I'd worn that day, thinking about everything it took to get there. Sometimes I'd look out the window and see younger pilots laughing, calling home, dreaming about families waiting for them. And for a brief second, I'd feel that ache again. The one that comes from knowing you gave your heart to someone who never understood its worth. I had spent so many years building his dreams, and now I was finally living mine. But there was still a quiet space inside me that hadn't healed completely. That's the thing about pain. It doesn't disappear when you conquer it. It just learns to sit quietly beside your strength. Every now and then, we'd get letters from home, small reminders that the world kept turning even when we were far away. I'd get messages from my daughter, short and polite, always starting with, "Hope you're doing well," and ending with, "Take care." There was distance in her words, not anger exactly, but something colder. She had believed the stories her father told, that I was the one who walked away from the family, that I chose duty over love. And maybe in a way, I did. But what she didn't understand was that sometimes you have to save yourself before you can be anyone's mother, sister, or friend. I never stopped loving her. I just learned to love her from afar, trusting that one day, truth would find its way to her. The world around me was changing too. New technology, new recruits, new faces filled with fire and fear. They reminded me of who I once was, naive, eager, desperate to be seen. So I made it my mission to be there for them, to be the calm in their storms the way someone once was for me. I'd sit with them during late nights, tell them stories about courage, and remind them that fear doesn't make you weak. It means you're still human. Sometimes they'd ask me how I managed to stay steady, how I learned not to break. I'd smile and say, "You don't learn it, you live through it." It wasn't long before I started training new pilots. Teaching gave me purpose, a way to pass on the lessons pain had carved into me. Every takeoff, every landing they mastered felt like a small victory, not just for them, but for me too. I saw pieces of myself in each of them, their doubt, their hunger, their quiet determination. And with each success, I felt myself growing lighter, as if all the hurt I'd carried for years was slowly dissolving into the air around us. But there was one thing I never talked about: my past. None of them knew about the man who once laughed at my dreams, or the years I spent being made small. I didn't tell them, not because I was ashamed, but because I didn't want to give that part of my life more power than it deserved. Instead, I let my work, my silence, and my strength tell the story. People often think healing comes with a big moment, a sudden clarity, but it doesn't. It comes quietly, like dawn after a long night, barely noticeable until you realize the darkness is gone. And so I kept flying, teaching, living. The name Iron Widow followed me everywhere, whispered with a mix of admiration and curiosity. Some thought it meant I'd lost someone in battle. Others assumed it was just a catchy nickname. I never explained it. Let them wonder. I preferred it that way. Because the truth was, that name wasn't about what I'd lost, it was about what I'd become. And I wasn't done becoming yet. One afternoon, after a long flight and an even longer briefing, I sat alone in the hangar, watching the sunlight slide across the wings of the aircraft. The others had gone home. Laughter still echoing faintly down the hall, but I stayed behind, feeling the calm that only comes after chaos. I ran my hand along the metal surface, thinking about everything this life had given me, and everything it had taken away. That's when it hit me. I had become the kind of woman I once looked up to, the kind who didn't need to explain her strength for people to see it. I wasn't trying to prove anything anymore. I was simply living the truth of who I was. A few days later, I got the call that my deployment was over, and I would finally be returning home. I packed my uniform carefully, folded it with the same hands that once trembled from uncertainty, and I smiled. It wasn't pride that I felt, it was gratitude. Gratitude that I survived the storms life sent, and still found peace in the sky. Before leaving the base, one of the younger pilots hugged me and said, "I want to be like you someday." I looked at her and said, "Then keep flying, no matter who tells you that you can't." That night, as the plane carried me back across the country, I looked out through the small window and saw the endless stretch of clouds glowing under the moon. It reminded me of how far I'd come, how many times I'd had to rebuild, how many times I chose grace when bitterness would have been easier. And I knew deep down that I didn't just find strength in flying, I found myself. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Iron Widow," not as a title, but as a reminder of the woman I had become. When I landed back home, it felt strange at first, like stepping into a life that had moved on without me. The air was softer, the streets quieter, and even the sky looked different. Wider somehow, as if it had been waiting for me to notice it again. I walked through the terminal with my bag slung over my shoulder, blending into the crowd, just another traveler returning from somewhere far away. And then I saw him. My ex-husband, standing near the gate with that same confident stance, arms crossed, pretending not to notice me but unable to look away for long. His eyes moved from my uniform to my face, and I could see that familiar smirk forming before he even opened his mouth. "So," he said, his voice dripping with that old arrogance, "you still filing paperwork for the army?" For a moment, I almost laughed. It was like time hadn't touched him at all, still trapped in that small world where he thought words could shrink me. But I had no anger left to give him. I just smiled politely, nodded slightly, and said, "Take care of yourself," before walking past. He tried to say something else, but I didn't hear it, or maybe I didn't care to. The sound of rolling suitcases and boarding calls was music enough. I had spent too many years letting his words define me. And in that brief moment, I realized how powerless they had become. I was no longer the woman who needed to defend herself. I was the woman who had already proved herself without him ever knowing. That encounter stayed with me, though not for the reasons he would imagine. It reminded me that people who never grow will always try to keep you small, and sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is smile and walk away. When I stepped outside, the warm air hit my face and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The past no longer felt like a wound, it felt like a lesson. I went home that night, unpacked my things slowly and sat by the window with a cup of tea, watching the planes trace white lines across the dark sky. And I thought to myself, he'll tell that story his way, like he always does, but the truth will stay right here with me. He'll say I was just a woman who worked behind a desk, and that's fine. Because I know the truth. I didn't just work for the army, I flew for it. And the sky remembers me, even if he never will. A few weeks after that day at the airport, life settled into a quiet rhythm again. I spent my mornings tending to my small garden and my evenings watching the sky change colors, the way I used to when I needed to think. Then one afternoon, my cousin called to say there was going to be a family barbecue, the first one in years, and she wanted me to come. I hesitated at first, not because I didn't want to see anyone, but because family gatherings have a way of bringing back old ghosts. Still, I agreed. I told myself it was just a meal, just a few hours, and besides, I was no longer the woman who had to shrink herself to fit into their comfort. When I arrived, laughter was already floating through the air. The smell of grilled meat and corn filling the yard, and for a moment I stood there quietly, taking it all in. People looked surprised to see me, though they tried to hide it behind smiles and hugs. I could feel the whispers, the subtle glances, the curiosity. I didn't mind. I had learned that silence is its own kind of power. My cousin rushed up, cheerful as ever, introducing me to everyone like I was a guest instead of family. That's when I met her new boyfriend, a tall man with too much confidence in his grin and a voice that carried louder than it needed to. He seemed the type who spoke before thinking, the kind that mistook volume for presence. At first he was polite, maybe even trying to charm me, asking about my time away and what I'd been doing. I kept my answers simple, careful, just enough to satisfy small talk. But then he overheard me mention something about the airfield, a small comment about how different the new runway lighting systems were, and his grin widened. "You talk like you've been in the cockpit," he said, half joking, half mocking. I wiped my hands on a napkin, smiled softly, and said, "I have." The table went quiet for a moment, just a brief pause before his laughter filled the space again. "Oh yeah? What's your call sign then?" he asked, still laughing, like the idea of me flying a plane was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. I didn't flinch, I didn't raise my voice, I just looked at him, my eyes steady, my smile calm, and said, "Iron Widow." His laughter stopped mid-breath. The words hung in the air like smoke that refused to fade. The man sitting beside him, a quiet, older gentleman with a worn navy cap, lifted his head slowly. His eyes narrowed, studying me, and I could see recognition hit him before he even spoke. His jaw tightened, and in a low, firm voice he said, "Boy, apologize. Now." The young man blinked, confused, then glanced at him and back at me. "Wait. What?" he stammered, but the older man didn't repeat himself. He just stared at me, his face pale, his expression a mixture of shock and respect. I didn't say another word. I just nodded slightly, a small acknowledgement, and went back to folding the napkin in my hands. The silence that followed said more than I ever could. It traveled through the whole table, settling in their chests, heavy and unforgettable. It was in that stillness that I realized something. There are moments in life when you don't have to shout to be heard. The truth has its own voice, and sometimes it only takes one sentence to change the way people see you forever. For a long moment, no one spoke. The air felt heavier than the smoke rising from the grill, and every sound in that yard seemed to fade, like even the wind was holding its breath. The young man's grin disappeared completely, his eyes darting from his father to me, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I could see the confusion on his face slowly turn into realization, the way pride always crumbles when truth stands too close. His father still hadn't looked away from me, and in his silence, there was something powerful. Something only those who've seen real service could understand. He finally gave a slow nod, not of greeting, but of respect, and that meant more to me than any medal ever could. I looked down at my plate, then back up at the people around the table, and I felt something shift. These were the same people who once pitied me, the same ones who whispered after the divorce, wondering what had become of poor Edna. But now, not one of them could meet my eyes. It wasn't anger I felt, it was peace. I didn't need their apologies, I didn't need their approval. That moment wasn't about revenge. It was about quiet justice, the kind that doesn't roar. It just settles deep in your bones and lets you breathe a little easier. When the young man finally muttered his apology, his voice was small, almost trembling. I just smiled and said, "It's all right." Because it was. I had already won the only battle that ever mattered, the one within myself. The Navy man gave me another small nod before turning away, his expression softer now, like he understood exactly what I'd carried all those years. And as the laughter slowly returned to the table, I leaned back in my chair watching the sunlight fade across the yard, feeling lighter than I had in decades. Some victories don't need witnesses, and that day, mine was written in silence. After that day, things felt different, not just around me but inside me too. People began treating me in a way they never had before, careful with their words, softer in their tone, and for the first time, I didn't feel invisible. I could see it in their eyes, the quiet mix of curiosity and regret, wondering how they never saw what was right in front of them all along. My cousin tried to brush off the moment with laughter, pretending it was nothing, but the truth had already settled in, and there was no one hearing it. Even my ex-husband, who had sat at the far end of the yard with that familiar smug look, couldn't quite keep it up. He glanced my way once, and I caught the flicker of something I never thought I'd see from him: unease. It wasn't fear, not exactly, but the sudden understanding that I was never the small woman he made me out to be. I didn't speak much after that. I didn't need to. Every smile, every quiet gesture that evening carried a meaning that words could never reach. I helped clear the dishes, thanked my cousin for the meal, and as I walked to my car, the air felt lighter, almost forgiving. It wasn't about pride or proving anything. It was about knowing that I had outgrown the version of myself that used to seek their validation. I had carried the weight of their judgment for years, and now it was gone. Just like that, lifted by one small truth spoken at the right time. On my drive home, I rolled the window down and let the wind hit my face, the night sky stretching endlessly above me. I thought about all those years I spent doubting myself, about the way silence can be mistaken for weakness, until the moment it finally speaks. That's the thing about dignity. It doesn't shout, it doesn't demand, it simply exists, and the right people recognize it without being told. I smiled to myself, feeling that deep, steady calm that comes only after you've made peace with everything that once tried to break you. I knew that night that I didn't just survive my past. I had reclaimed it. Driving home that night, I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet victory feels when it's real. It doesn't explode like fireworks or come with applause. It settles in slowly, soft and steady, like a deep breath after years of holding it in. The road stretched ahead, long and empty, and as the headlights swept across the asphalt, I thought about everything that had brought me here. The heartbreak, the rebuilding, the silence that everyone mistook for defeat. I realized then that maybe I owed life a thank you. Not for being kind, but for being honest enough to break me open so I could see what I was made of. When I reached home, I made myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the night sky. It was clear and endless, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel small beneath it. I thought of the young women I'd trained, of the ones still out there learning to trust their strength, and I hoped they would understand what I finally did. That strength isn't loud or sharp. It's quiet, patient, and sometimes it looks like starting over when everyone expects you to quit. As I sat there, memories drifted in and out, the laughter from that barbecue, the stunned silence that followed, the look in the Navy man's eyes. I smiled to myself, not out of pride, but peace. I had lived enough life to know that people can take credit, love, even your name, but they can never take the truth. And my truth was simple. I had lived through the storm and learned to fly through it. Everything after that was just weather. I finished my tea, turned off the light, and let the quiet fill the room. There was no need to tell anyone how far I'd come. The world already knew. Sometimes all you need to do is keep walking forward, head held high, and let your past echo softly behind you, reminding you how far you've flown. The following morning, I woke up before sunrise. The sky still painted in soft shades of gray and gold. I walked outside with my cup of coffee, feeling the cool air brush against my skin, and for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was running from anything. I just stood there, listening to the distant hum of the world waking up, and thought about how far I'd come from the woman I used to be. There was a peace in that stillness, the kind that comes only after you've made peace with both the past and yourself. I didn't need to look back anymore. I'd already learned what those years were meant to teach me. In the weeks that followed, I started speaking to young girls in the nearby community center, sharing what life had taught me about resilience and purpose. Some came because they wanted to learn about flying, others just wanted to listen. I told them that the world will always try to put you in a box, but it's your job to keep finding ways to climb out. I spoke about failure, about loneliness, and about strength that doesn't always look like courage at first. I wanted them to understand that there's power in choosing your own story, even if it means walking alone for a while. One afternoon, after one of those talks, a young woman handed me a small letter folded neatly into a square. She said she wrote it after hearing me speak the first time. Inside, in small, careful handwriting, she had written, "I didn't think I could ever be brave, but now I know I can. Thank you for showing me." I read those words over and over, and before I knew it, tears filled my eyes. It wasn't sadness, it was something deeper, something that felt like coming home. It was knowing that my story, the one that began with loss and silence, had turned into someone else's reason to believe. That night, I placed that letter in a small box with my medals and flight patches. It reminded me that strength isn't just about surviving. It's about leaving something behind that helps others find their own wings. As the days passed, I stopped thinking about who doubted me or who tried to keep me small. They had become part of the past, while I had become part of something much bigger. Every time I looked up and saw a plane crossing the sky, I felt that same familiar pull in my chest, a mix of nostalgia and pride, knowing that somewhere, someone was taking off for the first time and feeling what I once felt, the beautiful weightlessness of freedom. As time moved forward, I found myself living more gently, not because I was tired, but because I finally understood that peace doesn't come from forgetting, it comes from understanding. I began spending my evenings on the small balcony outside my home, a place where the air always smelled faintly of rain and freedom. I'd sit there and watch the sky fade from gold to blue, and I'd think about how everything I'd once feared had already happened. And yet, I was still standing. That realization changes a person. It makes you softer, but it also makes you unbreakable. I no longer carried the weight of proving myself. I carried only gratitude for the storms that built me, the silence that taught me, and the sky that never stopped calling my name. Sometimes I'd get letters from old friends, or messages from people who had heard parts of my story, thanking me for reminding them that it's never too late to start over. Each time, I'd smile quietly, because they didn't know that those words healed me, just as much as my story healed them. Life has a strange way of giving back what you put into it, often when you least expect it. I still visit the airfield now and then, just to stand near the planes and feel the hum of engines beneath my feet. It's like listening to a heartbeat that never fades. And every time one takes off, I look up and whisper a small thank you, to life, to the sky, and to the woman I fought to become. Thank you, my dear ones, for staying with me till the end. Your time and your hearts mean more than you know. If this story touched you in any way, please don't forget to subscribe, share it with someone who needs a little strength today, and leave your thoughts below. I always read them, and every word reminds me that even through distance, stories connect us all.